Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're diving into The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Feck by Mark Manson.
Oh, yeah. I love this book.
It's not about being totally indifferent, right?
Right.
It's about finding happiness and focusing on what matters to you. And we have expert speaker here to help us unpack all that,
Yeah, happy to be here.
especially for our younger listeners out there.
Yeah, this is a great book for younger people, I think, because it really helps you when you're just starting out in life,
Totally.
when you're figuring out who you are and what you want.
Manson uses Charles Bukowski as an example.
Right.
And he was a poet, a little rough around the edges.
Yeah.
But his whole thing was, even if you're a loser,
Mm-hmm.
you can find success if you own it.
It's about embracing your own path.
Yeah.
And part of that is accepting that you're not going to have it all figured out. You're going to make mistakes along the way.
Which he says is totally fine.
Which is totally fine.
So takeaway one, being wrong is part of the process.
Yes.
We're all going to screw up.
100%.
But it's what we learn from those experiences that matters.
Exactly. It's like, instead of seeing mistakes as failures, think of them as feedback.
Okay, that's a good way to look at it.
Yeah.
What happens when things go wrong, even if it's not our fault?
Right.
Life throws curveballs.
This is where Manson's disappointment panda comes in. The disappointment panda.
It's kind of this hilarious image he uses, but it makes a really serious point.
Oh.
Because we try so hard to avoid negative emotions, but they're actually really important signals.
So give us an example. Like if you burn yourself on a stove, the pain teaches you not to touch it again.
Exactly.
So how does the disappointment panda help us deal with bad stuff?
Yeah, it reminds us that disappointment, sadness, anger, those are all part of life.
Sure.
And they can actually guide us towards making changes or learning something about ourselves.
So instead of freaking out when things don't go our way, we should be asking ourselves, what can I learn from this? Precisely. And often the answer to that question leads to action, which Manson argues is actually the key to motivation, not the other way around.
Interesting.
Yeah, a lot of us wait to feel motivated before we do something,
Right.
but it actually works in reverse.
Okay, this is blowing my mind a little.
Yeah.
So he's saying, if you want to start working out, don't wait until you feel like going to the gym. Just put on your workout clothes.
Exactly. That small action can be enough to break the inertia.
Wow.
You might not be doing a full workout that first day, but you've taken a step, and that creates momentum.
That's such a simple but powerful idea. Action before motivation. I love that.
Yeah.
Okay, another thing Manson talks about is the importance of saying no,
Yes.
especially in relationships.
Yes.
So what's he getting at there?
He talks about how our culture glorifies romantic love almost to an unhealthy degree.
Like in fairy tales, when it's all about finding your soulmate and you live happily ever after.
Exactly. And those stories can set us up for disappointment because real-life relationships are messy. They take work, they take compromise. And sometimes even when we care about someone, we have to say no to protect ourselves and our own values.
So we need to be discerning about who we let into our lives and what we're willing to put up with.
Right. Saying no isn't about being selfish. It's about recognizing your own worth and having the courage to build relationships that are truly healthy and fulfilling.
So learning to set boundaries is a form of self-respect.
Absolutely. And speaking of big, sometimes scary topics, Manson uses this really intense example of almost jumping off a cliff
Okay.
to illustrate facing our fear of death.
Okay, that sounds heavy, but I'm guessing there's a metaphor here.
Yes.
How does almost jumping off a cliff help us live better lives?
Think of it this way. When you're confronted with the possibility of your own mortality, it makes you reevaluate what's truly important.
Right.
It's like a reset button for your priorities.
It's like that moment in a movie when someone has a near-death experience and suddenly all the petty stuff doesn't matter anymore.
Exactly.
They're just grateful to be alive.
Yeah, and that shift in perspective can be incredibly powerful. It allows us to let go of regrets, embrace new possibilities, and live more fully in the present moment.
So it's not about actually tempting fate, but using that awareness of our limited time to make choices that align with what we really want.
Precisely. And this ties into another crucial point Manson makes, which is about choosing our values.
Okay.
He argues that a lot of our struggles come from chasing the wrong things, what he calls shitty values.
Shitty values.
Okay.
Okay, what makes a value shitty in Manson's book?
He gives this example of this guy named Jimmy who was obsessed with external validation, money, status, always needing to be right.
Right.
But he was never truly happy. His values were based on what other people thought, not what actually mattered to him deep down.
I've been there. It's like that feeling you get when you post a selfie just for the likes.
Yes.
And you get a bunch, but then you just feel kind of empty afterward.
That's a perfect example. It's about recognizing that true fulfillment comes from within, from living in alignment with your own values, not trying to meet some external standard.
So how do we figure out what our values actually are?
Yeah.
It's not like they teach that in school.
He has a point there. He suggests asking yourself some tough questions like, what pain am I willing to endure? Or what am I willing to fight for?
Oh, wow.
The things we're willing to struggle for, those often reveal our true values.
That's deep. It's like if you're willing to work your butt off for something, even when it's hard, that tells you it's important to you.
Exactly. And once you identify your values, it's about aligning your actions with them. This is what he calls practical enlightenment.
Okay.
It's not about some perfect state of bliss,
Right.
but about navigating life's ups and downs with a clear sense of purpose.
It's like knowing what you stand for can make those tough decisions a little easier. You have a compass to guide you.
Absolutely. And even when things go wrong, which they inevitably will, Manson reminds us about what he calls the responsibility fault fallacy. We can get caught up in blaming others for our problems,
Yeah.
but true empowerment comes from focusing on what we can control.
It's like even if something isn't your fault, you still have a choice in how you respond to it.
Exactly. He gives this really powerful example of this man who lost his son in a car accident.
Oh, wow.
And the man wasn't responsible for the accident, but he was responsible for how he chose to move forward, how he chose to process his grief.
That's heavy stuff.
Yeah.
But it makes sense.
Yeah.
We can't always control what happens to us, but we can control how we react.
Precisely. And on a lighter note, Manson also talks about this thing he calls victimhood chic,
Victimhood chic.
which is basically this tendency to seek validation by portraying ourselves as victims even when it's not warranted.
So it's like turning your pain into a personality trait.
In a nutshell.
Yeah.
And Manson argues that this constant focus on how we've been wronged actually diminishes our own power.
It's like that saying, holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die.
Exactly. True strength comes from acknowledging our pain-taking responsibility for our part in the situation and then choosing to move forward.
So it's about owning your story without letting it define you.
Precisely. And that leads us to the importance of choosing your metrics carefully, meaning the standards by which you measure your own success and failure.
Metrics. Is this where things get all businessy?
Not at all. Think of it like this. How do you know if you're doing well in life? Is it having a ton of money? A fancy job? A million followers online?
Okay, those are definitely some common metrics. But they feel kind of hollow, especially when you see people who have all that and are still miserable.
Exactly. Manson uses the example of Dave Mustaine,
Okay.
this musician who was kicked out of Metallica right before they became mega famous.
Oh, wow. I know that story. Didn't he go on to form Megadeth?
Exactly.
That's a huge band.
And Mustaine was incredibly successful by most measures, but he was still using Metallica as his metric for success, and that created a lot of unnecessary suffering.
Wow.
He was measuring his accomplishments against the wrong yardstick.
So it's about defining what success means to you, not based on what other people are doing or some arbitrary standard.
Exactly. And this ties back to choosing your values. If you value creativity and making music that you love, then starting your own successful band is a pretty good metric for success, even if it's not the same path as someone else.
That's such an important message, especially with social media. It's easy to get caught up in comparing yourself to others and feeling like you're not good enough.
Absolutely. And that's why Manson's message is so important. You get to decide what matters to you. You have the power to define your own values, choose your own metrics, and create a life that is authentically and uniquely yours.
I love that. Now, you mentioned earlier that Manson traveled to Russia,
Yes.
and that experience really impacted him. What was it about Russian culture that resonated with this not giving a feck philosophy?
Well, Manson was struck by the directness and honesty of Russian culture. They tend to be very blunt in their communication, which can be jarring at first, but he found it refreshing.
So it's like not feeling the need to sugarcoat things or pretend to be overly polite.
Exactly. They say what they think, they express their emotions authentically, and they don't waste time on superficial pleasantries.
I could see how that would be appealing, especially if you're used to a culture where people are constantly worried about being judged or offending others.
Precisely. And that's what Manson is getting at with this whole not giving a feck thing.
Right.
It's not about being rude or insensitive, but about having the courage to be your authentic self, even if it makes some people uncomfortable.
So it's about setting boundaries, deciding what you're willing to tolerate and what you're not, and then communicating that clearly to the people in your life.
Precisely. And this applies to all types of relationships, not just romantic ones.
Now, speaking of relationships, you mentioned earlier that Manson uses Romeo and Juliet as an example of unhealthy romantic love. That's surprising. Most people think of that play as the ultimate love story.
Right, but Manson argues that it's actually a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked passion. He says we need to find a balance between our emotions and our reason,
Okay.
between our desire for connection and our need for autonomy.
So it's not about avoiding love altogether, but about building relationships that are both passionate and healthy.
Exactly. Relationships should enhance our lives, not consume them.
That's a great point. Yeah. Now, another concept that really stood out to me was this idea of action leading to motivation.
Yeah,
I feel like we're always told to wait for inspiration to strike, but Manson flips that on its head.
absolutely. He calls this the do something principle,
Okay.
and it's incredibly powerful. Basically, instead of waiting to feel motivated before you take action, you just start doing something at anything, and that action often creates the motivation you were waiting for.
So it's like tricking your brain into being productive.
In a way, yes. Manson talks about how he used this principle when he was starting his online business.
Okay.
He would often feel overwhelmed and unmotivated, but he would force himself to just sit down at his computer and do something, even if it was just for 15 minutes.
And that little bit of action was enough to get him going.
Exactly. He found that once he started working, the motivation would often follow. It's like breaking through that initial barrier of inertia.
That's such a valuable insight,
Right.
because I think we can all relate to feeling stuck sometimes, like we're waiting for the right time or the right amount of motivation. But Manson is saying there's no perfect time. Just start.
Precisely. And this applies to all areas of life, not just work. Whether you're trying to start a new hobby, learn a new skill, or even just clean your room, the do something principle can help you overcome procrastination and start making progress.
I love that. Now, there's one more concept that I wanted to touch on before we wrap up this idea of questioning our own beliefs.
Ah, yes. Manson is a big proponent of doubt. Not as a way to be negative, but as a tool for growth.
Okay.
He argues that we need to be willing to question our assumptions, even our most cherished beliefs.
Okay. But how do we do that without sending ourselves into an existential crisis?
Well, Manson suggests asking yourself simple but powerful questions like, what if I'm wrong? Or what would it mean if my belief wasn't true?
So it's about challenging our own perspectives
Mhm.
and being open to the possibility that we might not have all the answers.
Precisely. And this is where humility comes in.
Right.
None of us are right about everything, and that's okay.
Of course.
In fact, recognizing our own fallibility can make us more open-minded, compassionate, and ultimately happier.
It's like that saying, the only true wisdom is in knowing you know nothing.
Exactly. When we cling too tightly to our beliefs, we close ourselves off to new information and experiences.
Yeah.
But when we're willing to question and explore, we open ourselves up to a world of possibilities.
That's a great point.
Mm.
Now, I know we've talked a lot about choosing our values, but what happens when those values change?
Ah, that's a great question. Because as we grow and evolve, it's natural for our values to shift and change as well.
Exactly. What advice does Manson give for navigating those transitions?
Well, he acknowledges that it can be a difficult and uncomfortable process. He talks about experiencing uncertainty, feeling like you're losing your identity, and even facing rejection from people who don't understand your new perspective.
So it's not always a smooth ride.
Not at all. But he emphasizes the importance of self-compassion during these times. It's okay to feel lost or confused. It's a natural part of growth.
So give yourself permission to evolve.
Exactly. And he also talks about the importance of surrounding yourself with people who support your growth, even if they don't always agree with you.
So find your tribe, your people who get you, even when you're figuring things out.
Precisely. And remember, changing your values is a process, not an overnight transformation.
Yeah.
It takes time, reflection, and a willingness to be honest with yourself about what truly matters.
I love that. It's about being patient with yourself and trusting the journey.
Absolutely. And through that journey of self-discovery, you'll continue to refine your values, clarify your priorities, and create a life that is truly meaningful to you.
This has been incredibly insightful. Before we wrap up, I have one final question. Manson talks about the importance of commitment, but in a way that's different from how we usually think about it. Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. He challenges the idea that commitment equals restriction. He argues that true commitment can actually be incredibly freeing.
Okay, how? So that sounds kind of paradoxical.
He uses the example of his own life. For years, he was afraid to commit to anything, relationships, career paths, even where he lived. He was constantly chasing new experiences, afraid of missing out.
I think a lot of people, especially young adults, can relate to that fear of missing out, that feeling like you need to keep your options open.
Absolutely. But Manson realized that this constant pursuit of novelty was actually preventing him from experiencing the depth and richness that comes with commitment.
It's like spreading yourself too thin. You can't be fully present in any one area of your life if you're constantly worried about what else is out there.
Exactly. And he talks about how by committing to one woman, one career path, and one place to live, he was able to experience a level of fulfillment and meaning that he had never felt before.
So it's not about limiting yourself, but about focusing your energy and attention on the things that truly matter to you.
Precisely. It's about choosing to go deep rather than wide, to invest in the things and people that bring you joy and purpose.
That's such a valuable insight. Now, before we move on to our last big idea from the book, I wanted to circle back to something you mentioned earlier about Manson's experience with the blunt honesty he encountered in Russia. How does that tie into this idea of not giving a feck?
Well, he learned that sometimes being direct and honest, even if it's a little uncomfortable, can actually be the kindest and most respectful way to interact with others.
So it's about being authentic in your communication, not just saying what you think people want to hear.
Exactly. It's about communicating your needs and boundaries clearly and respectfully, even if it means having some difficult conversations.
That takes courage. But it's about building relationships on a foundation of honesty and mutual respect.
Exactly. Now, before we wrap up this deep dive, I wanted to bring us back to one of the most powerful and perhaps daunting concepts in the book, the idea of confronting our own mortality.
Yes, that's a big one. It can feel kind of scary to think about our own mortality. But Manson argues that it's actually essential for living a more fulfilling life.
Precisely. It's about acknowledging the preciousness and fragility of life, which can then motivate us to make the most of each day.
It's like that saying, live each day as if it were your last, but maybe without the skydiving and reckless abandon.
Right. It's not about throwing caution to the wind, but about approaching life with intention and a deep appreciation for the gift of each moment.
So how can we practically integrate this awareness of our mortality into our daily lives?
Manson suggests practices like meditation, journaling, or even just spending time in nature, anything that helps you connect with the present moment and appreciate the impermanence of it all.
It's about finding those little reminders to be present, to savor the good stuff and to not sweat the small stuff.
Exactly. And when we can embrace that perspective, when we can let go of our need to control everything and accept the natural flow of life, that's when we can truly begin to live authentically and fearlessly.
Wow, that's deep. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. From embracing our mistakes to confronting our mortality, it's a lot to process. But for our younger listeners especially, what's the one big takeaway you hope they walk away with from the subtle art of not giving a feck?
You know, I think if there's one message that really resonates, it's this. You get to decide what matters to you. You have the power to define your own values, choose your own metrics for success, and create a life that is uniquely and authentically yours.
It's like you're not just along for the ride. You're the one behind the wheel.
Exactly. And that's an incredibly empowering message, especially when you're young and figuring things out. It's about embracing the journey with all its ups and downs and trusting yourself to make choices that align with your values, even if they're not always popular or conventional.
That's amazing advice, and it's something I think we could all use a reminder of from time to time, no matter what stage of life we're in. Expert speaker. This has been such an insightful deep dive into the subtle art of not giving a feck. Thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. It's been a great conversation.
And for our listeners, if you're intrigued by what you've heard today, we highly recommend checking out the book. It's a quick read, but it's packed with thought-provoking insights that can really shift your perspective.
And remember, it's not about being indifferent or apathetic. It's about being intentional with your energy, your attention, and your time, and choosing to focus on what truly matters to you.
Words to live by. Thanks again for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep living a life that's true to you.